Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Interna Talks. Today we have three items we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about Google's change in direction on third-party cookies in Chrome. We're going to talk the hacks in AT&T and the outage in CrowdStrike. And then we're talking about Nvidia and their competitors. And for all of these, we're going to ask about what does this mean for us as people that develop products, people that rely on other people's products in product management engineering. So I've got the same cast of characters, Jeff Yoke, Eddie Scheck, Mark Golden, and Ross Webb with me, all part of Interna. So let's just jump into it. So recently, in the last few days, Google changed course 180 degrees, where before they said for protection of consumers, they weren't going to have third-party cookies. It was only going to be first-party cookies. Companies that you went to their website would be able to cookie you, but not other things they linked up on anymore, like advertisers or information trackers. Their position was that having third parties track you around the web was perhaps more effective for them, but once again, you're tracked around the web, and that wasn't good for consumers. They've backed off this. They said they're no longer going to do this, and you'll still be able to have third-party cookies. So my question is, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for us as product developers? What does this mean for us as consumers? Maybe those are the same, maybe those are different. What do we think about this? I'm going to start with Ross here. Ross, what are your thoughts here?
Hey, David. Hey, everybody watching this. Great to be back with everybody again today. My thoughts are, when it comes to cookies, I consider this to be a marketing challenge. And I remember, when iOS 14 came out and everybody who was running retargeting through Facebook ads kind of had minor heart palpitations when that happened. And I think this is a recurrence of that. I think as marketers who are struggling, and I'm looking at that, I'm not talking about here product developers specifically, or engineers who are building products that need to have like a pop-up or something basic like that might engage in those type of cookies. I'm talking about kind of tracking and marketing style cookies. I think marketers have got to get better. I think they need to move more into branding. And if you're relying on a iOS 14 era style of tracking people around every single way they go to try and sell them a pair of shoes, I think you need to do better. Easy for me to say as a product manager to tell marketers what to do, but it strikes me as this is a problem that marketers have got to stop relying on things that they were able to rely on, especially and in the B2B space where attribution is terrible. And there's so much happening on the dark web. In other words, your attribution software, your Marketos, etc., aren't tracking how people came to you. Marketers have got to get a lot better there as well.
So you're concerned about it primarily from a marketing standpoint, not as concerned about it from a security standpoint from the end user.
Well, I'm looking at it from a marketing to the end user perspective. And let's say from a privacy perspective, I'm saying that people have been using that as a shortcut to be able to get in front of a lot of people and getting around various kind of privacy issues. And I don't think they should be allowed to do that. And I think as consumers, we shouldn't have that. I'm not talking to this specifically the security aspects, as in like cybersecurity, et cetera, tracking from that type of security issue, because I'm not a security expert. But I have done a lot of digital marketing over the years, and that is an area that people have really relied on, and they shouldn't have. So I can't really talk to the cybersecurity issues because I'm not an expert in that space. But it's a problem. I mean, I've worked with lots of advertising solutions over the years, and so many of them rely on cookies, which they shouldn't be doing going forward.
So my argument is similar to yours, but my argument is that there's going to be a big sigh of relief from the advertisers in the world, from the marketing people of the world, because I think people had no good solution. They hadn't come up with a good solution. Um, and I had seen, and some of our clients were scrambling to figure this out. Now they don't have to. Now, from a personal information side, this is just, as Ross said, just the opposite. But I suspect that if Google didn't do it, the only way it's going to happen if the EU legislates that it has to happen, or California. Those tend to be the two faster or legal entities that make things happen. The EU is already pushing for this for sure.
Yes, and I've been tracking that a bit because I live in Europe, but not in the EU anymore. but it's I think they are going to keep pushing for it. I think they're going to push harder for it. I think they're right to do that. And I think as you said, advertisers are going to take a deep breath, but I think it's just a delay until the inevitable does happen, and Google will be forced to do it by, I think, the EU before California.
Yep.
But I stand to be corrected on that. You're definitely closer to
Yeah.
California than I am.
Living in California, yes, by definition.
Physically, yeah. But yeah, that's my view.
Okay, so you're a product company. Go ahead, Mark.
Sounds like a serious shot across the bows, though. I mean, this has been in the works for a long time. It was pulled back at the last minute. I think Ross is right. I think developers should take notice that this is coming and look into alternatives.
So let's say you're a product company that creates different products that rely on cookies for advertising, or your GTM, Google Tag Manager, that kind of thing. You're still developing as fast as possible for a cookie-free world. Is that right? Is that your argument?
You should be at least investing resources in that, yes, if possible.
One of the questions that always occurs to me is which direction to dedicate those resources. As you guys know, I work with a lot of ad tech companies. And faced with this challenge upcoming, people move to a lot of consideration of machine fingerprinting, where you take other things. I can't talk a lot about the details of this because it's mostly proprietary stuff, but things like looking and to see what kind of Chrome extensions are installed on a particular machine, because everybody ends up with a bunch of plugins and things like that installed. It turns out those are fairly unique when taken in combination. So should the effort be to operate similarly to the way we operate with third-party cookies, but not relying on the actual cookies? Or, as I think Ross was sort of suggesting, taking a different approach entirely?
My argument is it's a two-step thing. People are going to follow the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. So they'll take the fingerprinting, and then that's going to be outlawed as well.
Mm-hmm.
So be prepared for a braver, newer world. So I'm going to jump ahead then. We had two serious cybersecurity issues, or maybe that's not fair to call them both cybersecurity issues, but one cybersecurity issue, one software release issue that upset, in one case, the United States, and the other side, the whole world. And I'm talking about the AT&T hack, which people have now forgotten in light of the CrowdStrike issue that brought down significant parts of the world's computing infrastructure. So I want to talk about both of these as a contrast. Now, for people that don't know, or people that may have forgotten, AT&T got hacked. AT&T mobile phones got hacked, for non-US listeners. And information about customer data was stolen. Not customer names per se, but phone numbers, locations, phone numbers that other phone numbers called, that kind of stuff. Enough information that you could identify who the person was, where they'd been, and with whom they conversed, which is significant. This is significant enough that this is the first known incident where the FBI has prevented early release of a hack to the general public because they thought that it was a potential national security issue. If you know where people were generally, you could find out where they worked. If you could find out where they worked and you figured out who they talked to, you might be able to find out, if you will, and this is my air quotes, the secret agents with whom they coordinated. I'm sure it's much more nuanced and complicated than that. I have never worked at a 3-letter agency, but that was significant. So that was one incident. And that happened, call it 2 weeks ago. And then, just a few days ago, CrowdStrike released an update to their software. And it brought down Windows operating systems across the world. Not only did it bring them down, but in order to fix them, you need physical access to the servers. So bringing them back up is very difficult. Now, that was a software release, not a cybersecurity threat. The first one was a cybersecurity issue. What should we learn about these? Are these the same? Let's start with there. Are these the same or are these different? Can we learn the same thing or do we learn different things? I'm going to start with Eddie.
Well, first of all, I mean, I absolutely agree with you that the CrowdStrike issue is not a cybersecurity issue. Right? It happens to be caused by a company that work is in cybersecurity, but fundamentally it's a software release issue, right? And the big takeaway is, why did they roll out a change? They probably didn't expect it to have the kind of impact it had. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. But like without any kind of phase rollout, right? If they had anticipated that the impact or the potential impact, or and the other thing for product development practice perspective, right? I think my understanding is the update that caused the problem was considered to be a content, which happened to affect business logic and functional behavior of the system, not just content. So the question really is, I think, for how should company handle release of content or configuration versus code? I think that's really the question. I think obviously the best thing to do is to version control, test everything that changed, not just code, but configuration. Treat configuration as code, treat content as code, and QA and release all of that in the same way.
So sorry to interrupt. I used to give this, this will be a giveaway for any developer that interviews with me in the future. I used to give this interview question: what's the difference between data and code? And the answer is nothing. It's perspective. To a compiler or interpreter, what the developer thinks of code is actually just data, right? And so I'm going to talk more about this particular issue because I hope it will help the listeners think about it. And I'm going to get particularly nerdy right now, so I apologize for everyone who may not be interested, but I'll stay nerdy for just a moment. Think about the operating system as two parts: the kernel and the user part, where the kernel is just the operating system and device drivers, the thing that control the lowest part of memory, and any program you load is effectively the user part. And the reason that it's bifurcated into those two parts is the kernel protects the security of the operating system and the memory. And in this case, CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity protection company, and so they operate in the kernel. And so they can do things that are really damaging, and if they make a mistake, it brings down the whole operating system by design as a safety feature. Because what they're doing is so important that it has to get signed by Microsoft. Their drivers that they build have to get signed by Microsoft in order to be releasable. And the problem that creates is if there's a cybersecurity threat and you have to go through the signing process, which could take a long time, CrowdStrike may not react to it. So what they did is they did exactly what Eddie suggested. They had what they called their code signed by Microsoft and a bunch of data files that they would update without Microsoft ever looking at it in real time. And that data file was actually other code. So they hacked around what the safe process was. So Eddie's suggestion is more QA around what CrowdStrike considered their data files. course, that might create that problem of not being able to react to cybersecurity threats they're supposed to protect against as quickly as possible. So whose fault is this? Is this CrowdStrike's fault? Is this Microsoft's fault for allowing this to happen? Is this Delta Airlines is the airline that has the largest effect, that licenses, that bought a license to CrowdStrike, claiming that they shouldn't have to pay. I don't mean to get political about this. They shouldn't have to pay for people displaced on their air flights because this was out of their control. The FAA or the Department of Transportation said, no, this was in your control. Was this the consumers of CrowdStrike's fault? What should we do as Microsoft, as CrowdStrike, so call it the operating system developer, the app developer, the product developer who kind of we represent or we work with at Interna, or the licensor? Who should have picked up on this? Who should have made sure this didn't happen?
So to answer your question, I'd say, well, first of all, at some level, all of the above. Microsoft allowing access to their kernel. Not all operating system providers do that. Mac doesn't, for example. So maybe there's a question there. I believe Microsoft were forced to allow access to their kernel, on the other hand, through some kind of consent decree, probably from the EU. But that's arguable. CrowdStrike clearly didn't do adequate testing because a bad update was leaked out. So did they not have enough time? Maybe, but clearly they didn't do enough testing. But I think there's also a lot of responsibility on the part of of those running the software. Delta Airlines, in your example, or software companies hosting Windows servers. A best practice is not to roll out critical updates directly into production. Don't you normally roll them out first into lower tier servers, test them there, leave them running for a few days, and then roll them out into production? If there was some reason why it couldn't be done in this case, I'm not aware of it. Maybe the time sensitivity of it, maybe it was too onerous to do. But if these had been tested on lower tier servers first, i.e. non-production servers, it would have been caught in time and it wouldn't have grounded airplanes and had the devastating effect that it had.
So you agree with Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, that at least Delta Airlines has responsibility? I'm not asking you to take
I do.
political
I do at least shared responsibility. I have a medical friend he's a radiologist. He's not had access to his equipment since still as of this morning. So the impact of these can be long-lasting, expensive, and potentially life-threatening.
Yeah. So what do we do differently in the future? We being as an industry, as a product, let's be CrowdStrike first and then Microsoft. You kind of discussed about the rollout strategy, Mark. I'm going to go with Jeff. Do you have an opinion about what we should do differently as an industry? What should we at Interna be telling our clients about how to think about this if you are dealing on the kernel level? Let's start with that.
Looking at the three kind of areas of responsibility, probably we primarily encounter two. One is people who are building things like this, where we can work to help to craft better release processes and try to ensure that they're followed, so that things don't hit as a bomb in this nature. And second, a lot of our customers are more likely to be people who are very technical in software organizations that also utilize these kinds of services. And then we can talk about the kinds of things that I think it was Mark was talking about releasing these to non-production servers and what the upgrade path should be. I think the hardest one is what to do with less technical and smaller organizations that are still nonetheless vulnerable to it. A radiologist who doesn't have access to his equipment days later, or his machinery days later, was probably never in a position to release it to to staging versions of the servers and test it adequately. And there's a real question of, is it even reasonable to hope that a radiologist will do that? So I'm not sure that far downstream what we can do, but trying to encourage better practices further up the technology chain is the only thing I can really see within reach.
So on that note, one of my relatives who was just in town with me till early this morning works at a hospital, not different from Mark's friend, and she's in the IT department, and they basically called all hands. And it's a large hospital. They called all hands in to remediate this issue with CrowdStrike and go server by server to integrate things with BitLocker, and it's very painful, but very similar to what Mark is going to. Uh, that might argue for more central authority for putting some of these things out there, which there's reason to not want that as well. I'm not going to go into those details right now. But Ross, from a product standpoint, we're CrowdStrike or we're Microsoft. Let's be CrowdStrike for a moment. And we're releasing product. Is it incumbent on us to tell our licensees how to slow our releases when we are trying to get quick releases out? Because we're trying to be either agile and or there's 0-day attacks we're trying to defend against.
Yeah, when things are mission critical like this, I wouldn't say, being agile is a good approach necessarily, or taking the traditional agile approach. From my perspective as product leaders, we own this. If I remember once having someone on a public app store kind of publicly berate me and give me a 1-star review, and I came back, explained to him it wasn't intentional, but I own it. I own it. I'm the product lead. I'm the head of products here. It's my mistake, and this is what I'm going to do to fix it and apologize, etc. And thank God that at least that 1-star got changed to a 5-star. And that's a relatively trivial example. But I think what I haven't heard, and what I would like to hear, is I'd like to have heard that product leader step up and go, yeah, we screwed up here, and here's the things that we 100% are going to change. Maybe that's been done. I haven't read that. I've read a lot of kind of finger pointing, and if CrowdStrike really owned it, even if the share price took a 30% dip, or maybe that's not even as much as it would be. But yes, some people are getting fired. I get that, but that product leader needs to step up, and at least eventually the CEO needs to stand up and go, we made a huge mistake. And maybe it's, the insurance liabilities are so large that if CrowdStrike took that approach, it would possibly go out of business due to litigation. But if that wasn't the case, like if we could just pretend that litigation, putting companies out of business wasn't a thing, and a product leader should stand up and go, I dropped the ball. This is how I'm going to make sure that we do it. Because I think everything around the product is related to the product. It's not just, hey, this is how you install it, click these buttons and everything's good or bad. It's also, hey, what about the documentation? What about the education? What about, as Mark said, do not do this. Do not push go to production unless, you've tested it for X number of days. And have people been educated? Have they passed the testing for doing that? So there's so much that goes into a product than just, as you know, David. But that's my view from a product leadership perspective. Huge drop of the ball, and I haven't seen any communication that says to me that they actually own the product. Sorry, that they own the problem.
Yeah, so the CEO's come out and said, hey, we screwed up in a press release, but no one else has, and they haven't detailed how it happened yet, or the remediation. But I definitely agree with you, and I say this a lot, is a product is not releasing software onto servers. That is a component of the product, exactly what you're saying, Ross. It's whatever documentation you need, getting the rest of the company ready to support the product, getting the customers ready. Software is just, it's a necessary but not sufficient component of the product. And so, yes, I completely agree with what you're saying. Before we move on, Eddie, you have anything here?
A little bit side thought is stuff like this actually happens a lot, right? Every time Microsoft releases a big patch or an update, there's a non-trivial number of computers getting bricked or having issue because the number of possible configurations are infinite. Now, this is a case that's really, for the CrowdStrike scenario, this is actually very curious. It is because it affects basically all configuration, right? It affects all Windows computers, more or less, right? So if it's a developer pushing out content change, and he didn't break his own or her or them. I don't know who it is, right? They didn't break their own computer. Or did they even like have it running on their own computer before they push it out? Because it should break their own computer. So it's have to a lot of things fell through. It's not even a crack here. So that's kind of just very curious because of the extent of it's not tied to any real specific configuration. I don't know how broadly it affects everything.
Well, here's one thing that I know. Someone's getting fired. Maybe not the right person, but someone's definitely getting fired. Maybe several somebodies.
Maybe it'll be the head of the Secret Service.
Yeah. Well, yes, that happened as well. That happened as well this morning. So it's this is a significant issue that happened.
They know who it is. They are just choosing not to disclose it.
Oh, for sure, they know who it is. There's actually dumps and traces that show exactly the line of configuration that failed,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all over the internet. Like they know exactly what register was not properly loaded. So, so clearly, and it'll be really interesting what CrowdStrike says publicly, and if they're public about the changes they make in their development and product organization about that. We'll certainly follow up and learn whatever we can learn to bring it back here. It's unclear what going back to AT&T, it's unclear what they will or won't publish about their security failure. This is not the first one they've had. It's clearly not the first anyone's had. There was a Target hack a few years ago, but AT&T had one a few months ago that was not as significant, but this is two significant technology events in just a few weeks. So everyone should be watching and tracking it. So now I'm gonna shift to Nvidia. Nvidia is, and this number I'm making up because everyone says 80% for any number that's large volume that they're not sure, but Nvidia owns approximately 80% of the GPU business. They're far ahead of everybody in terms of technology, integration, developer resources devoted to them. And the blockchain industry was very dependent on them. The AI industry is very dependent on them. Graphics games were very dependent on them. Hence the name GPU. Excuse me. Far and ahead, the leader. And they own not just the chip infrastructure, they own the networking backbone in data centers because they have so much volume they need. They own the integration between the GPUs and the memory chips and architectures on that are unique. And I would argue, most importantly, they own CUDA, which is the API set, the programming language, if you will, that people use to address the GPUs. And they have this virtuous cycle. You want to develop something new for AI that requires a GPU, for instance. You're going to hire developers. They already know CUDA. You already have this whole infrastructure that exists in your data center. You're going to build something new. Your developers are going to say, well, I know CUDA, I want to use it. It's fast. It's the fastest chips out there. It's already integrated in the data center. They have this virtual cycle that makes people want to use more and more NVIDIA. The problem is NVIDIA's chips are really expensive, really, really expensive. Tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes in different configurations. And the users of those chips can't afford them. They can't get enough of them because TSMC can't produce enough yet. There's just not enough produced. And so the buyers of the chips, Amazon, for instance, Microsoft, GCP, want to find a more cost-effective way. AMD and Intel want in on that, some of that cash flow, some of that revenue flow, if you will. And then there's new startups that are trying to be specialized and eat into NVIDIA's market share. Does it happen? Does NVIDIA stay the leader? Or is it a natural monopoly? Or do one of these three other companies, chip manufacturers, cloud providers who are making their own chips and therefore obfuscating the direct usage of chips for their APIs, or these new startups, do any of these three groups of companies eat into NVIDIA's market share? And what does that mean for people that are using these chips? I'm going to go with Ross again. I'm going to start with Ross. What do you think?
David, I'm more worried about something different. I'm more worried about the electricity that all these chips take. And I'm worried that with the increase of AI and GPU data centers are going to be increasing massively over the next few years, how are the electricity grid's going to cope with that? Like, that's my one major concern. The other concern I've got is, I think that, I remember back in the 90s, obviously, and I'm sure everybody on this call does, when the Pentium chips came out with Intel, and everybody was convinced for the next 20 years, nobody will ever be able to do anything with Intel. And then it goes back to what's Clayton Christensen's innovator's dilemma, where he used hard drives. But if we look at kind of GPUs or CPUs, maybe, they're smaller. Maybe right now AI is it, but maybe there'll be subcomponents of AI that will be like where the mobile chips at the beginning, Intel wasn't that interested. So, other manufacturers had an opportunity to move in there. And I'm just using Clayton, the Innovator's Dilemma by Christensen just as an example. So from my perspective, I think the fact that there is so much margin in it from NVIDIA and they are so far ahead means that hopefully with competition, there's going to be a huge amount, but there's going to be a lot of competition nipping at their heels when, everybody also thought at some stage all the chips for the Mac are always going to be like Intel chips, and all of a sudden Apple was like, no, we're going to change that. So I'm less concerned about having everything just only being bought into NVIDIA going forward. I'm really concerned about the electricity grid. And I'm hopeful that, competition being what it is, and when people seeing the margins that NVIDIA are getting, that there's going to be a huge amount of competition, which hopefully should drive those prices down as well.
Well, and I should say, by the way, for the record, I hold NVIDIA stock and AMD stock, as well as stock in all the cloud providers. So the audience should know that. I'm sure the SEC requires me to say something like that. I think that's interesting what you say. The electricity problem is significantly severe. NVIDIA claims to be the most energy efficient by compute of any chip out there. I don't know if that's true or not, but even in the case that everything's the most efficient, if NVIDIA is right, the energy requirements 2 or 3x for a GPU loaded data center than it is for a CPU loaded data center. It is significant. And actually on the stock market, a lot of energy providers have seen a drive up in their stock prices with the drive, similar to the drive up in NVIDIA, or at least not linearly, but a huge increase in their stock price. I think that's non-trivial. I think the Clay Christensen reference, by the way, if anyone hasn't read Innovator's Dilemma or several other Clay Christensen's book, he was brilliant. He was a professor at the Harvard Business School. I highly suggest you read his books, and particularly Innovator's Dilemma, which was his first famous one. I would agree with most of your argument. I'm going to disagree with parts of it. I'm going to emphasize parts. I think there'll be smaller LLMs, smaller models in general, and that some of the big chips that NVIDIA is creating, I guess this is in agreement with what you were saying about Apple, won't be as necessary for training, right? There's training and there's inference, right? And the training chips need to be beefier than the inference chips. Apple is clearly trying to put training on the phones and in some of what I think they call their neural chips on phones. And so I think models will get smaller. That'll be interesting. That will eat away at some of the need for the highest margin chips for NVIDIA. I think the cloud providers, they're all creating their own chips. And to the extent that I use a different cloud service and their native AI services, I won't care what chips I'll get I won't care what chips are in the back end. That'll eat some of it. I think the biggest threat to NVIDIA is none of those. And I'm interested to hear what other people say. And I think this goes to your innovator's dilemma issue, Ross, is NVIDIA grew so big because there were no other kind of chips that could provide the tensor units, if you will, the linear algebra done at high speed in a parallel fashion. And that's good for a certain kind of problem. And I think my guess is the biggest killer of GPUs, in particular for NVIDIA, is a different kind of problem set that solves problems that we do not know what they are yet, that don't need the tensor units, that don't need the big matrix manipulations, that instead use something else. And I'd be less concerned about the one-for-one competitors, AMD and Intel. If I was NVIDIA, I'd be concerned about quantum computing or something like that.
Well, at least three of our topics this morning point to a diversification problem. Part of the reason why the AT&T breach was so massive and so impactful is the sheer size of AT&T. So many subscribers impacted. Same with Windows and CrowdStrike, 8.5 million Windows devices. So many of the world's operating systems are running on Windows. It's nice on the one hand, but it's also devastating on the other. And here you've got Nvidia, which is moving towards a monopoly status as well, and they earn it. They have a fantastic story. They're founder-led, and they didn't get here by accident. But lack of diversity certainly causes a problem. And if you think about, does anybody know where Nvidia's chips are manufactured?
All in Taiwan.
All in Taiwan. Okay, enough said. So anything, even some kind of a global catastrophe, a geopolitical problem, could put an end to, or at least put a significant dent in NVIDIA's monopoly.
Yeah. The bad news about that is the geopolitics of TSMC doing all their most advanced chips at one plant or a series of plants next to each other in Taiwan affects not only NVIDIA, but all the advanced chips in the world.
True, but there are others, and there's been incentives recently to bring some of that chip processing or manufacturing and back into the United States, back home. So hopefully we'll see some diversified solutions. I'm not saying these are overnight answers, but diversification and all of those things that we just discussed, I think, is super important. We shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah. So you're arguing against the monocultural problem.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Well, that's all for today, everybody. Thanks for participating. And we'll be back with another one of these in a month.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.